I am delighted to be here today. And as I understand it, I'm one of your first speakers to speak about the 20th century. So I'm very excited about that. And if you are not a person that focuses on 20th century history, hopefully you will still gain some insight from this talk. So thank you so much, Dr. Nordham, for inviting me to speak today. I am just delighted to be a part of this series, and thank you to the university and your research training group for hosting me. Um, so before I get started, because of the nature of the service academy where I work, I have to remind you that I'm speaking out of my personal views exclusively. So my views are mine alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. government, the U.S. Air Force, or the U.S. Air Force Academy. So with that disclaimer, I am going to share some slides because I have some images to show you. Okay, so the title of my talk, can you all see this? Yeah, good. Okay. So the title of my talk today is Open Door Paternalism in Early Cold War U.S. Intelligence on China. And so the images that you see here on the left, excuse me, you have Colonel David Barrett and Mao Zedong. This is on the first day of the Dixie mission, which I'm going to be telling you about. This is the first sustained official contact between U.S. officials and the Chinese Communist Party. On the right, you have a picture that was taken about 20 years later. And this is American U-2 high altitude surveillance planes that were shot down by the PLA. And the pieces collected and reassembled for display. And so these are two endpoints. The first on the left, you have a situation where the relationship is basically an unknown quantity. It hasn't been determined if there's enmity or not. The CCP is basically a completely unknown quantity to the U.S. And they are just there in an open-minded sort of a way. And the picture on the right, we are in this full Cold War experience where, high altitude surveillance and espionage and covert operations are happening, and there is a threat of nuclear war. So these are the endpoints that we're working with for my talk. And I think this is work that I've already been doing, but it fits in so well to the theme of your series. Thinking about this enmity is completely, it's not inevitable, right? It's not predetermined in the 1940s, and yet it develops very quickly. So I'm going to be offering some of the things that I found from my research findings, looking closely at the personal relationships between these Americans who visited the Chinese Communist Party leaders during World War II and the little information that I could get from the Chinese side. All right, so let's dive right in here. So U.S. intelligence officials in the 1950s assumed that communist China lacked the ability to independently develop modern military capabilities, especially nuclear weapons. Instead, they were certain that the Chinese Communist Party required Soviet assistance to achieve military goals. This was a determination and assumption that they made. Paternalistic assumptions like this about China's backwardness fed the hypothesis. So one of my main research interests is, where do these paternalistic assumptions come from? We can see that they're damaging. I think, I'll leave it up to you to decide if they're gone from the relationship in present times. I think they look really stark in these early Cold War examples. And this assumption that the Americans had made turned out to be wrong. It precipitated a cascade of flawed intelligence assessments leading up to China's successful test of a nuclear bomb in 1964. These intelligence failures occurred despite millions of dollars spent on high-tech collection tools, such as the U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. In fact, the tools tended to reinforce confidence in intelligence assessments rather than introduce doubt. So let me see if I can advance these slides. Okay, so here is a clip from one of the assessments, 1955. So approximately 2 months before Lockheed test pilot Tony LeVere took the first U-2 on its maiden voyage in August 1955, well-respected CIA intelligence analyst Sherman Kent, after whom the CIA's analytic training school is currently named. That's how famous this analyst was. He wrote one of the first U.S. intelligence assessments of China's nuclear ambitions. So this is June 1955. And he wrote, Communist China almost certainly could not develop significant capabilities for the production of nuclear weapons within the next 10 years unless it were given substantial external assistance. Without such assistance, the development of an adequate industrial base and a supply of trained scientific and technical personnel sufficient to support an effective nuclear weapons program would probably take well over 10 and possibly 20 years. Instead, China took 9 years and had no assistance. Minimal Soviet assistance. Soviets never gave them the plans, and their bomb didn't follow a Soviet model, which uses plutonium. Okay, so this begs the question, how does the US get it so wrong? How does the US get it so wrong 10 years after they have US military officials embedded with the Chinese Communist Party in World War II? How does this relationship go so bad? That's the question that interests me right now. Okay, so when Kent wrote his estimate, discussions of a nuclear weapons program were already underway in Beijing. In 1954, a year before Kent's report, Mao had issued a secret directive to the PLA to gather Chinese scientists and explore starting a nuclear program, a completely indigenous one. By April 1956, the program had enough momentum that Mao informed the entire Chinese Communist Party Politburo in a speech celebrating this progress. And he argues at this time that the nuclear bomb is necessary for deterrence. So this quote comes from that meeting. He says, "We still don't have the atomic bomb, but in the past, we didn't have airplanes or artillery either. We relied on millet and rifles to defeat the Japanese imperialists and Chiang Kai-shek. Now we're already stronger than we were in the past, and in the future, we'll be even stronger than now. Not only are we going to have more airplanes and artillery, but also the atomic bomb. In today's world, if we don't want to be bullied, we have to have this thing." And I think this is such an important quote for understanding how Mao sees grand strategy, how he sees China's potential for survival in the world as a new country. And I think that this shapes a lot of decisions that he makes about things like the Great Leap Forward. Obviously, it's not the only factor influencing those decisions, but this is, it reveals a lot of his thinking about why deterrence is so important, how it's going to work, and the resources that are required to support it. And so I think I come back to this quote regularly, especially this last part where he says, if we don't want to be bullied, we have to have this thing. He's ready to do whatever it takes to get the nuclear weapon, with the belief that if China doesn't, they're going to be swallowed up by somebody. They're going to be back to this century of humiliation that comes up in the rhetoric throughout the 20th century up to now. And so they see the atomic weapon as that important. It's an existential choice. So he had determined that the nuclear weapon would provide an undeniable deterrent to any other country that encroached on Chinese sovereignty. This was not actually paranoia at the time either. So a lot of Americans don't realize that the US was literally running covert operations into China at this time in the 1950s. And they were rescuing and supporting remaining Kuomintang troops that hadn't mobilized to Taiwan yet. And they were, stirring up other things in hopes that they could turn the regime. So it's not, out of nowhere that Mao gets this idea. China had also fought undeclared military conflict with Russia in the 20th century. And so they're in this, space where they don't really trust either power in in the Cold War. So Mao is prepared to take extreme measures to ensure that China develops a nuclear weapons capability. Um, he held out hope for Soviet aid for the first few years, and then he gave up the optimism. He realized they're not going to give me the plans. So instead, he rounded up top Chinese scientists who had studied physics, engineering, and chemistry in China and abroad. So China had scientists that were working in Europe, that were working in Fermi's lab, that were working in labs of scientists in the US that became part of the Manhattan Project. And so nuclear physics was something that had been a global project in the beginning of the 20th century, before it was weaponized. And so Mao found these scientists, gathered them together. Together, they worked to develop the nuclear payload, which was based on enriched uranium, not plutonium like the Russian bomb. They also developed the entire supply chain and all the machines required to produce the payload. And on top of that, because of this validated paranoia, they ran an active denial and deception campaign, hiding factories in urban areas and keeping tight operational security. So the program was not located in places and with signatures that the US would have necessarily thought to look for it. But what added insult to injury is that the US was actually looking for a Russian style bomb. So they were looking for signatures of plutonium. And when they didn't find them, assumed them not to be there. So October 1964, the People's Republic of China celebrated detonating its first nuclear device at the remote Lop Nur test site in Xinjiang. So the bomb used this uranium-235 that Chinese scientists had indigenously mined, enriched within China to trigger a fission implosion, yielding a 20 kiloton explosive reaction. So enough at the time to produce that deterrent effect, Mao believed. By this time, US intelligence officials had updated their assessments. In 1964, they anticipated that a PRC nuclear bomb test could happen at any time. But China's methods for developing a successful bomb contradicted the most important assumptions US intelligence analysts had made about Chinese capabilities, even with the benefit of this expensive overhead imagery for intelligence collection. So there's a lot to unpack in this case, right? There's many different ways that we could analyze the dimensions of this relationship from this mistaken assumption. And I'm going to focus today on the kind of paternalism that warped the views of US analysts to get us this assumption in the first place. So talking about its origins, its historical context, and this one particular case of World War II where you can really see it in action. So where did some of these problematic assumptions come from? US intelligence assessments of the PRC from the 1950s and 1960s show this clear pattern of underestimating China's technical and military capabilities. And I think that this reflects what historian Michael H. Hunt described in his classic 1983 book as the special relationship that many Americans felt that they had with China. Now, sometimes this phrase special relationship, especially in this period that I'm talking about, the 40s and 50s, gets used to talk about the relationship between the US and the UK, like Great Britain and US. But for a long time in China studies, special relationship has also referred to this US open door relationship. And you can see this depicted sort of in the picture of the middle. Uncle Sam is sort of like, well, we're different than the other imperialists. Uncle Sam's saying, we're China's older brother and we're going to save them from the Europeans who have carved them up and keep the door open for everybody to come through and trade. And so Michael Hunt's book explored this relationship and the fact that it wasn't an equal relationship. Maybe it was a special relationship, but not a relationship of equals. And so Michael Hunt was actually one of my mentors. He was on my dissertation committee, and I worked with him a little bit when I was at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, doing my dissertation. And so this idea of open door paternalism that he puts out in his 1983 book really captivated me. It was in my mind when I started to look at these other research records. So he argues that a paternalistic open door constituency of Americans, this is a quote, propagated a vision of defending and reforming China, unquote, that assumed China lacked the capability for self-reform and required the assistance of the United States, whether or not China sought it. So China may not want this help, but the US is going to give it either way. More recently, another scholar, Zach Friedman, has argued that World War II caused a shift in American attitudes toward a, quote, post-imperial mode of domination and wielding power, unquote. He also notes that the vital role of American air power in the war and the sense that Americans could, quote, fly anything, anywhere, anytime. So these two ideas together really inspired me to think about how does this affect this first contact between American military officials and the CCP? So to go in depth on the role of open door paternalism in transforming the CCP-US relationship from ambiguous to enmity, I'm going to be speaking about my book that was just released this autumn. It's called Mission to Mao. The book is the result of research in 6 different archives in the United States and Taiwan. Archives in the PRC, especially on this topic, have generally not been open to US researchers, especially ones from the US Air Force Academy. and so this, my book, my project is very much focused on the attitudes and cultural and social factors that influence the Americans. And I would love to see a new book come out with Chinese sources on this. That is an opportunity for someone else, but that is an unfortunate gap with mine, that I don't know what the Chinese thought of these Americans. I have to speculate. So, and these pictures before I move on. So you see a clipper ship that, the US finding ways, technological ways to intervene in the China trade. This is the origins of US-China relations, is the US, people in the US developing this innovative ship to enter the China trade and wedge their way in. And that sets a tone for the relationship. In the middle, you have this picture of, it's a cartoon of the open door. Uncle Sam ready to hold the door open so that the entire world can trade, whether China wants that or not. And on the right, you have a picture of US air power flying supplies into China over the Himalayas. Okay, so getting right into the heart of the Dixie mission, this is, the primary subject of my book. From 1944 to 1947, the US Army G2 Division, that's the intelligence division, led an interagency delegation of US intelligence, diplomatic, and military officials that operated from the Chinese Communist Party base area of Yunnan, China. The mission was the first sustained official contact between US officials and the Chinese Communist leadership. So you may notice, looking at this photo, that it's slightly unusual in some ways. It doesn't look like the official photo of such a meeting, right? So for one thing, you can notice how not everyone is looking at the camera at the same time. People's faces are in different directions. The image is uncentered and the right side is out of focus. No US military official photographers visited this remote and secretive location until very late in the mission. I'm going to show you one picture. It's like one of the only pictures in the US archives that was taken by an official US military photographer, and it's much later. So this picture was taken by a journalist who just happened to be there with a camera at the time that this mission showed up. Most of the photos that I have are early time, or the earliest part of this mission. They're amateur snaps that people just took. So members of the mission, some of them had little cameras and brought back pictures, and different reporters that passed through sometimes took pictures of them. And identifying, like, I know all the names of the people in this picture, but identifying which people in the picture match up with my names was very, very difficult. A second thing that you may notice about this picture, the uniforms of the Americans have no insignia. They were a joint unit representing the spectrum of existing American intelligence agencies, but they did not want to be recognized as such. So it was not very popular with Chiang Kai-shek to have this group going to Yunnan. and they didn't want to be recognized by KMT, by Russians, by Japanese. And so they removed all badges and insignia, and they all look the same. And so this is unique. This is unique for US military operations in World War II. The American Army Colonel, David Barrett, who led the mission, he is seated in the middle. He's the bald gentleman seated between Judah there and Zhou Enlai in the center. And, so he's with the top military and foreign policy leaders of the CCP. There is some asymmetry in rank there. So he is an American colonel. If you don't know much about the military, a colonel is an officer who leads a lot of people below them, but also has a lot of leadership above them, right? And so he is not a general. He is not leading, whole divisions in China. And so he significantly underranks the people that he's sitting with, but that is who the U.S. chose to send. So this group comes to Yan'an with just a vague laundry list of orders. It's like 20 things long. It directs them to observe communist guerrilla operations against the occupying Japanese, and also just get to know the communist leaders themselves, because the U.S. is getting really frustrated with Chiang Kai-shek. The U.S., especially Stilwell, I'm going to talk about him in a minute, getting really frustrated with Chiang Kai-shek. And so they're hoping that these communists might be another way, another route to get accomplished what America wants to accomplish in China. The mission was extremely controversial with Chiang Kai-shek, who was the main U.S. counterpart at the time. Chiang Kai-shek's party, the Nationalists, the Kuomintang, was in a tense and dissolving alliance with the communists against Japan. And they had isolated the communists to areas in North China, especially Yan'an, where this mission happens. So the story of this mission is as complicated as the rest of Chinese history in the 20th century, or Chinese history in general. So I'm going to try to give some context and clear explanations at the outset here. And then I'll introduce my main findings that show enmity between the Chinese communists and the United States was neither likely nor inevitable. During World War II, there were possibilities and ambiguity for the diplomatic future of these actors. So it develops later. I think it develops because of open door paternalism. So I'm going to talk first about the CCP-US relations during the Dixie mission, and then I'll advance forward in time a bit to show the implications of this first contact in the later intelligence collection. So that's where I'll kind of wrap up. I argue that cultural forces, especially the influence of Christian missionary work in China, shaped American attitudes towards intelligence work in the 1940s and 1950s. And this set a tone for this relationship that the Chinese certainly recognized. US didn't. They were not aware of it. It was subconscious to them. And so I refer to these attitudes as open door paternalism. So here's a map. I think this crowd is probably pretty familiar with this map. This is the map from my book. And so you can see this is China generally under the time of World War II, the gray area where Beijing and Nanjing are, that's the occupied. And you can see how close Yan'an is to that and how far away Chongqing is to that. And then here's another look at a map that has a little bit more detail where you can see Yan'an a little bit more clearly. And on this one, you can see how the communists made that long march, end up in Yan'an. And, while we're looking at this map, I want to note for you, Yan'an is not a place that Americans are getting to without air power. This is not a place where there are roads that you can just drive there. And in fact, one of David Barrett's primary missions was to lead a convoy from Chongqing to Yan'an to bring trucks and equipment that were too heavy for air power to bring there. And that took months. And there's all these stories of the trucks being stuck in the mud and whatever. So this is an engagement that occurs, because of American air power. So in 1944, Army General Joseph Stilwell was serving as commander of U.S. troops in China and chief of staff to Chiang Kai-shek, but the two disagreed vehemently on plans for defeating the Japanese. So I go into a lot more detail about this in my book. General Stilwell was trained in World War I. He's a West Point general. He has this very infantry-based focus, and and so Chinese troops were being sent into these infantry situations, jungle fighting, and they were losing. And so Chiang Kai-shek was making the argument, no, the solution to the war here is air power, and General Stilwell didn't want to hear it. Stilwell's aides were a tight-knit cohort in China. They recommended exploring communist war fighting, and he went along with it. So Stilwell helped push the idea with FDR's White House, which eventually wore Chiang Kai-shek down. And the U.S. Army Observer Group began in July 1944. So it's almost toward the end of the war. By then, it was already known among U.S. officials in China as the Dixie Mission. And there's a number of explanations for why they call it the Dixie Mission. They mostly started calling it the Dixie Mission amongst themselves because Chiang Kai-shek was so opposed to having the U.S. there that it had to have a code name among themselves. And so they got the idea for this from this popular song that was about, wondering how things are in the American South. And so the idea of the word Dixie referring to rebel areas stuck to this mission. They called it the Dixie Mission. So the mission is widely known to people interested in the history of U.S.-China relations. It has attracted scrutiny from both politicians and historians in the 80 years since it occurred. One of the reasons why I was able to do the project in the way that I could do it, the level of detail, is because it was so controversial that Congress pushed for almost all the materials to be declassified. So I had a huge data set of correspondence to work with. Most of the focus of other historians in the past has been on determining to what extent the mission might have affected the bilateral relations at the highest levels. So there's widespread debate on this, how this enmity develops between them at the time. So that wasn't the question that I entered the project with. My question was actually, what does this mission say about U.S. intelligence capabilities during World War II? And what I found was that this open door paternalism makes whatever technical methodologies and tradecraft that might have led to unbiased intelligence assessments, it almost makes those things moot. And so I found that really interesting. And I think it speaks to this question of enmity, right? Okay, so let me tell you, well, I'm mindful of the time. I'm going to tell you my 5 main conclusions. I'm just going to list them off. And then in the time I have left, I'll give you as much detail about each one as I can. Okay. And so if we have to cut it short, you've at least heard the 5. So let me just list them off. So first conclusion from this project. U.S. officials relied on the compliance, support, and expertise of local hosts in China to achieve their strategic objectives. And they often failed to appreciate local points of view. So they're showing up, they're expecting their hosts to show them how everything works, but then they just do whatever they want after that. Second conclusion, U.S. air power essential to U.S. intelligence activities in China during World War II. The things that we were doing for intelligence not happening without the planes. Third, America approaches responsibilities in China during World War II with a considerable amount of paternalistic hubris, this open door paternalism. This became a bias, warping and politicizing both U.S. intelligence and diplomacy. Fourth, U.S. so-called subject matter experts, that's what the Pentagon calls them now. In the 1940s, these people often came into intelligence jobs with ideological and cultural baggage that influenced their work. This had to do with the open door policy. So these people had either been the sons and daughters of Protestant Christian missionaries in China. They'd grown up in China, and that's how they learned about China, learned to function in China, learn Chinese, or they had been sent to China with the U.S. military and learned Chinese that way. So these 2 ways of becoming subject matter experts left an imprint that affected how they did their work. And then fifth, despite some noteworthy successes, especially in Europe, American intelligence did not have its act together in World War II. U.S. officials often created their own obstacles through rivalry, duplication of effort, and poor communication, right? So that is an important takeaway for my colleagues who are intelligence historians. In this conversation, what's important about that is that this is the first impression the Chinese communists have of the United States. And they come into this relationship, I think, I don't have the documents, but they come into this relationship thinking that the U.S. is larger than life, right? That The US might be their savior. They are the ally. And what they see is kind of a hot mess. It's kind of a hot mess. And so I cannot prove that Mao Zedong thought it was a hot mess, but you would think that anyone looking at how these Americans function with each other would come away with that impression. So that's really important if we're thinking about how do you go from a relationship that's ambiguous or an unknown quantity to enmity in like 10 years. Okay, so let me tell you in the time we have left as much as I can about these conclusions and give you a few anecdotes that kind of show you what I'm talking about. So the first conclusion, U.S. officials relied on the compliance support and expertise of local hosts in China to achieve their strategic objectives, and they often failed to appreciate local points of view. So let me show you these pictures. So Yunnan is in a remote area. It doesn't even have a proper airfield. And so I'm going to tell you this story that is from December 7th, 1944. So this is 3 years after Pearl Harbor. And this is a story that I use in the opening of the book. So Colonel Barrett, who you see here, with Zhou Enlai, the two of them are in Chongqing, and they're sitting on this C-47 airplane that you see pictured on the right. And they're returning to Yunnan after meetings with Chiang Kai-shek and the rest of the American delegation in Chongqing. They were on their third attempt to fly out of Chongqing in over a week because the weather in Chongqing was not cooperating. So the pilot that flew this plane, I did not make this up. His name is literally Jack Champion. It is like fiction. But Jack Champion had refused to take them because he thought it was too dangerous. And he kept encountering this ice on the plane's propellers that he would have to knock off. And so he told Barrett, we're not going. He said, quote, he had already used up too many points flying around China. So they're finally on this third try, going to take off. They have high spirits. They're 2/3 of the way through this flight. And Zhou Enlai looks out the window and he says to Barrett, we're going the wrong way. We're not, he sees some river on the ground or something. And he's like, no, we're headed in the complete wrong direction. And so Barrett describes Zhou as calm, which is really difficult for me to believe. I mean, maybe from Zhou Enlai, from what we know about him. But so below them is this rural desert and mountain areas like you might expect if you're flying from Chongqing to Yunnan, right? And so to the west, there's Tibet and Xinjiang. If they go that way, there's no airfields, no refueling, right? They're just lost in the desert. And to the north and east, the plane is going to encounter Japanese anti-aircraft artillery. And if they go toward the southeast, then they're going to encounter the Guomindang, who doesn't want to see them, right? And so this is a very dangerous situation. So Zhou Enlai moves into the cockpit of this plane next to Champion, and he's like visually navigating the pilot back to Yunnan, and they make it. And so this is one of the most dramatic stories of this. But the US is trusting the Chinese communists to give them accurate information for protection, right? But then after this, there's no thank you. There's no, building of trust from this experience, this existential experience that they were both in. It's just like expected. That's what they would do. Okay, so that has to, I think, make some kind of difference to the Chinese. They're not developing a relationship in a normal way. So Barrett, for his part, he was pretty close and cordial and charitable toward these leaders. They had a close personal relationship. He recognized that without Zhou's guidance, the plane likely would have run out of fuel and crash landed, what he says, quote, somewhere in the marches of Tibet. Power dynamics enabled Americans to overlook their reliance on local expertise and to never learn local context. So I found that kind of characteristic of these things. When the US needs the Chinese, they rely on that with trust, but it's not a two-way street. Okay, so moving to the second point here. My second conclusion, US air power was essential to US intelligence activities in China during World War II. It becomes this almost symbol of America during World War II. So it's providing support for China's military, it's providing food aid, it's providing correspondence, it's carrying intelligence in and out of Yunnan, and it's really helping China win the war with Japan. This is the perception. So, and air power, the Dixie mission is not happening without this airplane. And so I'm going to show you another picture here. They started calling this airplane the Wounded Duck because when it first lands, this is the very first impression of the Chinese communists to these Americans. So they have been told Yan'an is hard to find. There's no radio tower. They're aware of that famous pagoda. Any of you that have ever been there would recognize that pagoda that's on the hill. They're looking for this landmark. They see this airstrip where they're supposed to land that was built about 20 years prior by Standard Oil. So American oil developers were in the area trying to make oil wells, and they had built this airfield. And so Champion's like, there it is. We're going to do this. And so he lands on this runway, and they're coming to a stop, and the wheel, the front wheel, the one that you see there, falls into the ground. There's a grave under this airfield. It was improperly built. And like, who puts a grave under an airfield? I don't know. It falls through. The propeller comes up through the cockpit, nearly kills Champion. And they basically crash land into Yan'an. And there's this whole color guard assembled for them to welcome them. And everyone is just like open mouth. And they get off the plane, and Barrett says, well, we've arrived here at last. And then it just goes on. And so there is this atmosphere of air powers coming in. It's the only way they're getting there. It's not perfect. And once they get there, they're going to make do. So they call the plane the Wounded Duck. In addition to personnel, planes carried supplies and favors into Yan'an. They carried intelligence, captured documents, regional publications came out. Without roads, planes and radio were the only ways of getting intelligence out of location. Radios required brief and coded messages, so they weren't as effective as bringing things on paper or photographs out on planes. The OSS also the OSS is the precursor to the CIA. They originally sent radios that required power supplies that Yan'an didn't have. The radios were too advanced for the infrastructure of Yan'an. And so the OSS had to get historical radios to send to Yan'an on the planes. They also sent back captured Japanese newspapers. And Dixie, it needed supplies, right? Yan'an, you see on the right, that's what Yan'an looked like in the 40s. And people living in caves. Some of the Americans, they had an American medic who actually had to revive people because these caves were cold. And they would have a brazier of coals to keep them warm. And it would cause carbon monoxide poisoning all the time. And they'd have to revive each other in these caves. So supplies, paper, medicine. They also brought fun things like movies. So Mao Zedong was known to love Laurel and Hardy and Marlene Dietrich. So they would watch movies that the Americans brought projected on a wall on Saturday nights. At American Thanksgiving, they would fly in turkeys and have a Thanksgiving party together. So they used these American goods for building these positive relationships with the CCP. And the Chinese leaders probably tolerated some US activities that they might not have without access to air power. So this idea that I showed you later on, now noticing that the atomic weapon is so important to deterrence, and this is a thing, a technology in the world that we have to have. In the 40s, he's recognizing air power as being that. And then air power is important to the very end. The final episode of the Dixie mission in March 1947, the last pilot takes off from this old Yan'an airstrip, and what he sees in the background is dust, because as soon as this plane takes off, the Chinese communists blow up the airstrip. They don't want the Americans to be able to come back. They don't want the Kuomintang to be able to land there. And so this is like the start of the worst part of the Civil War for that location. So air power, very important. Moving to my third conclusion here. Maybe we'll get through them all. Maybe. So America approached its responsibilities in China during World War II with a considerable amount of paternalistic hubris. This became a bias, warping and politicizing both U.S. intelligence and diplomacy. And a big part of this was what historians now call the Stilwell myth. So here you see Joseph Stilwell, the general, on the left, and there you see him with Madame Chiang Kai-shek, smiling and laughing. I think that picture was actually taken on the lawn of the White House because they visited the White House at one point. So Joseph Stilwell portrayed himself in Washington as a friend to China and an expert on Chinese culture who was hamstrung by the ineffectual and stubborn Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, whom he called the peanut, not a term of endearment. Historians in the past 20 years, with the benefit of newly released documents in China and, some in the United States or some documents in the United States, have argued that Stilwell had ample personal and political reasons for disparaging Chiang. And these documents have not supported Stilwell's assessments about Chiang's military leadership or the strengths and weaknesses of the Chinese army or anything like that. In fact, the sources show Stilwell as a classic U.S. Army strategist, attempting to apply a World War I era infantry-focused outlook on the China-Burma-India campaign with not great results. He distrusted air power, and he felt rivalry with Chennault, who is the main American general that was in charge of planes in China. These two were rivals. So he designed land-based operations in Burma, and they were disastrous. Instead of admitting that his plans were the problem, Stilwell blamed the Chinese, and especially Chiang Kai-shek. So Stilwell's paternalistic view of China was symptomatic of the U.S. presence in China from the 1870s up to World War II in the era of the open door policy. So at this time, the U.S. is, moving through this evolving kind of neo-imperialism. The U.S. is determined to save China from the evils of what it sees as European imperialism and bring it into the liberal world order, whether or not China wants. So many of the people that become part of the Dixie mission were part of Stilwell's personal cohort. David Barrett is one of those. They had worked together for years. So here you see Barrett pictured on the right. And so this brings us to my fourth conclusion. U.S. subject matter experts in the 1940s often came into intelligence jobs with ideological and cultural baggage that influenced their work. So Stilwell and the leader of the American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, this precursor to the CIA, they didn't always agree. They didn't get along very often, but they agreed on one thing. It was useful to have American military and intelligence officers who spoke Chinese, because otherwise they would be subjected to Chiang Kai-shek's interpreters, whom they believed to be biased spies, probably accurately. So Chiang Kai-shek would send interpreters into meetings that would report back the entire context. And so certainly if you're gonna learn something unique about the Chinese Communist Party, you better have Americans that can speak Chinese directly to them, so you don't have to have these minders in the room. In the 1940s, there were two cohorts of Americans in China who spoke Chinese well enough and who were interested in public service. So these were U.S. servicemen, especially those with the Army's 15th Infantry, and you see the logo of that on the left, and the sons of Protestant missionaries, and some of the daughters too. So the Army's 15th Infantry Regiment was stationed in China for securing U.S. commercial interests after the Boxer Rebellion. And then they stayed on to protect American business interests after the Boxer Rebellion in that period of political instability, and for training and services that we would now recognize as military attaché services. So that's what they were doing in Beijing, Nanjing, Tianjin, throughout like the first half of the 20th century before World War II. And so I think, for us that are coming from a cultural history perspective, this logo and this slogan are so interesting. I mean, this is an American military regiment that is closely identified with a history of guarding American interests in China to the extent that they have this golden dragon on their seal. They have this slogan, "Can do," which I think is reflective of this attitude of open door paternalism. This idea that Americans are going to get to this backward and remote location of China, and we're going to bring our hygiene and we're going to bring our modernity and our technology, and we're going to lead China into the future with those things. And we can do it, even if it's remote and we're far from home. And so this, these attitudes kind of reinforce each other in this personal cohort of Stilwell. So the 15th Regiment also included George Marshall, the Marshall Plan, General George Marshall, Joseph Stilwell, David Barrett. These men were all together learning Chinese, leading each other, forming the attaché component of the US in the 1920s and 1930s. So when Stilwell needs to find Americans who speak Chinese to lead this mission to Yunnan, these are the people that he trusts, that he thinks of immediately. So the second cohort, missionary kids, and here you see a picture of the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association in China, much earlier than the Dixie Mission. I think this picture is from like 1900, 1905. And on the right, you see Chinese Communist Party leaders in Yunnan in the 40s. And the man in the middle is John Peyton Davies. And he was one of these missionary kids who becomes a famous diplomat. And then he also becomes very, very famously a target of Senator Joseph McCarthy for his charitable views towards Chinese communists. And so he wasn't a member of the Dixie Mission, but he made several extended visits there. And he is one of the three people that had the idea for the Dixie Mission and talked Stilwell into it. So Protestant missionaries often raised their families in China. And in like the late 1800s, early 20th century, going to China from the US, that is a difficult, expensive trip. They did not come back and forth very often. And so there were whole families that just were Americans existing in China for generations. And so the children frequently became fluent in Chinese, sometimes multiple dialects of Chinese. Sometimes they were more fluent in Chinese than they were in English and more familiar with China than they were with America. Missionary families often worked in social welfare organizations, such as orphanages, hospitals, schools. If you think about like Beijing University, parts of this started as missionary schools. Some of the main hospitals in China today started as missionary efforts. So even though these missionaries were not necessarily converting lots of people to Christianity, they were supporting the Christian ideals that were part of open door paternalism, right? So these ideals were sort of baked into these subject matter experts. These were the ideas that they grew up with. Missionary kids were used to assimilating and recognizing nuance. They were cosmopolitan. They were citizens of the world. They were used to operating in remote conditions and relying on individual resourcefulness and autonomy. They didn't always ask headquarters for permission. It was too far away. Okay. So you imagine these people suddenly in Yunnan with these ambiguous laundry list of orders, get to know these Chinese communists, figure out if we can work with them. What could go wrong? What could go wrong, right? So they bring this open door paternalism into those relationships. That is the first impression, the first deep impression that the Chinese Communist Party leaders get of Americans. These people that are here to help us, whether we want it or not, that have a particular view of us being backward and them having a message to save us. They know a lot about China. They know a lot about living and working in China. So they don't, they don't stick out the way that some other foreigners do. And in some ways, I think that might have made it worse. So moving to sort of a point where I wrap up. This is that one picture I promised you that is an official picture. This is taken by the U.S. Army Signals Corps, who were the ones with the cameras that would go into areas. And so you probably recognize the Chinese officials here, many of you. The two Americans, the one with the bow tie is Ambassador Patrick Hurley, who is sort of the opposite of a person that understood China on a deep level. So if you can imagine the opposite of a subject matter expert in the 1940s, that would be Patrick Hurley. And the man sitting to his right, who's American, is Ivan Yeaton, who was, had worked directly with the White Russians in World War I and stayed on in the Soviet Union to sort of fight communism in the 20s. And so that was his perspective. And so after the Dixie mission, first members were perceived to get a little too friendly with Mao Zedong. The army replaced all of them, Barrett and the rest of them, the rest of these subject matter experts that spoke good Chinese. They replaced them with Yeaton and his people, anti-communists. They replaced the ambassador with Hurley, a person who doesn't understand China. And this is all happening within 3 years to the Chinese communists. They're watching, okay, these people come in who understand China, and, we have some problems with them, but we can have a conversation with them. And the way that they're doing things sort of looks like a hot mess, but they have this attitude of can do, and they're helping us, we're helping them. And then sudden switch, and you get these two people. And it's like a 180. And no one's taking the time to explain it. And so we have to wonder what the Chinese communists make of this. It seems like fertile ground for enmity to develop to me. So the conclusion here, U.S. officials often created their own obstacles through rivalry, duplication of effort, and poor communication. Within the Army, this is a joint mission, the Dixie mission. So it has people from all different agencies. Those agencies are competing for budgetary resources. They don't necessarily get along. They don't share information. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this quote about them, but there are many different quotes where they talk about how difficult it is to communicate, to do their jobs, to explain the conditions back to headquarters and accomplish intelligence in this area. Chinese communists are presumably witnessing all of these problems, and I think it probably challenged their perceptions of America. So in conclusion, the Dixie mission brought together U.S. officials and CCP leaders in the 1940s for open communications. And these were cordial and accommodating, but they're not free from these cultural attitudes and postures that the U.S. officials brought with them, or the power dynamics that came with American air power. The Dixie mission and its results and end contributed to the first impressions of the CCP of the U.S., but the Dixie mission did not change the U.S. impressions of the CCP. So, so I can say that again, like this is the first impression that Mao Zedong and those other leaders that you see pictured here have of the U.S. officials, their first lasting impression. And this mission in the US context is so secretive, so controversial, so involving of lower level people that it is not an intelligence success. It's not a diplomatic success. It's largely unknown to many Americans. And what they learn about the CCP makes a difference to America. So the impressions that America has of the Chinese communists developed from other forces and influences, largely not from one-on-one relationships between Americans and Mao or Americans and Zhou Enlai. By the 1950s, the stakes of this relationship had intensified and the perceptions had solidified into what we might consider enmity. So it happens very quickly. Okay, so that's the end of my prepared remarks, and I'm so eager to hear your questions. Let me take down these slides. Oh, and that's the information about my book, if anyone's interested in that. So it's Mission to Mao, out on Georgetown, and you can reach me at this email.